For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. My guest for this episode is Samantha Zipporah. Samantha is devoted to breaking the spells of oppression in reproductive and sexual health through education, healing, and liberation. She has over 20 years of experience honing her craft as an educator, guide, and caregiver, tending to fertility, sex, and cycles spanning the full womb continuum. Sam's work rises from an ancient lineage of midwives, witches, and wise women. A fierce champion of critical thinking skills, her knowledge is integrative and inclusive of modern medicine and science, as well as traditional and ancient healing practices. Sam provides vital education for everyone from professionals to preteens in her books, courses, and live classes. Her online community, The Fruit of Knowledge, features monthly live workshops and an abundance of resources and dialogue for womb wisdom keepers and seekers. In this conversation, Samantha and I talk about rewilding contraception and a few of the threads connected to that. Well, thank you for coming on the Rewilding Podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
I wanted to just kind of start out with sort of the anecdote for how we ended up having this conversation, which is that, I was posting all of these memes about rewilding on my Instagram because there was one that was somebody posted a meme what is rewilding? And it was sort of the multi-level marketing spiritual sort of clip art created meme of take your shoes off and walk around barefoot, spend a day in nature, turn off your cell phone for the weekend. It was all just sort of forest bathing and stuff like that. And all of the graphics were a naked feminine form or whatever, by a cis feminine, person doing something illustrated. And it just really annoyed me because I hate it when people limit rewilding to very specific things or conflate it with something like forest bathing, which could be, it could be part of, yeah, exactly. Part of somebody's rewilding for sure. Certain. Anyway, so I made a whole bunch of these different memes, and one of them, eventually they started becoming, originally they were sort of authentic to what I believe rewilding is. And then eventually they sort of shifted to satire. And there's a particular person who does a rewilding for women program, and I did a satire of her specifically, but it was also sort of people could have interpreted it generally for that particular type of online, again, sort of multi-level marketing with a particular subculture around those concepts. And, there was a lot of people thought it was funny. Some people were like, this is actually, sad, you shouldn't be making fun of this because these are real needs or whatever, and it's the internet. So anything that you do is going to be taken in a million different ways, right? There's no way to make a thing that everybody's going to like, or everybody's going to laugh at with you or whatever, or cry with you, Yeah. Anyway. And so I think what happened was you saw that and reached out and was like, some of this is important. We should talk about this stuff. And I agree with you 100%. I really appreciate your work around these similar concepts. And so it made sense then, yes, to kind of go behind this sort of meme and this criticism and talk about some really important things. Um, and of course, we scheduled this conversation, or we've been talking about this for months now, and then recently Roe v. Wade was, taken aback. And so I feel like although we have this already kind of scheduled to talk about, it's even more important now than when we originally thought about it. So yeah, I'm deeply appreciative of your work, and I'm really glad that you reached out, and I'm happy to have you on the podcast.
Yeah. I mean, so we met at Tessa's gatherings. And I think when I first reached out to you to be involved with Rewilding was this desire to teach children about the menstrual cycle, actually at Echoes in Time,
Oh, awesome.
which is like full circle. Um, you asked me to prepare questions for you as well, and we'll get there eventually, I suppose. But it's just sort of like, can we include fertility awareness and cycle awareness as survival skills?
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, the memes I thought were really hilarious. And especially when I was in Portland, I would get invited to all of these like red tent goddess, divine feminine type events that would always rub me the wrong way. People were like, "This is what you're about, isn't it?" I'm like, "No, not really." But yeah, that's my memory, was like, I want to teach about the menstrual cycle to the
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah, that's
And
awesome.
then let's make fun of the multi-level marketing aesthetic of the rewild woman. And then I was like, can we please talk about contraception and abortion and how it existed before the 70s?
Totally. Yes.
So there's a
Yeah.
lot. We're
Yeah.
here now, though.
Yeah. So let's start
We've
out.
arrived.
Yeah, we've arrived. We're here. Yeah, let's start out talking about, clarifying language around sort of, there's lots of different terms for, uh, gender, women, and I'm curious, like how you navigate that terrain, especially with this sort of, aesthetic of it being definitely very like cis, bio woman. I'm like the language is constantly changing for me, and it's not really the
Sure.
field that I'm a part of, even though I'm adjacent. So yeah, how do you navigate all of the sort of perceptions around this, and how do you look at it sort of biologically as well?
Oy vey. I mean, I think that it's simplest and easiest just to say person. And I've refer to specific body parts and specific biological processes, and don't assume the gender or sexual preference of the person to whom that biology belongs. That's really my bottom line. There's been many, trial and error moments of learning and evolution over the years, but I'm at a space right now where I'm really particular with anything that I will publish, being inclusive, and yeah, just wanting people to have access to this basic reality of physiology with full respect. If you want to alter your physiology, fabulous, but let's start with a foundational understanding of how it functions, so that when you are making other choices, that you're making informed, consensual ones. And I don't, yeah, I mean, that's an entire podcast in and
For
of
sure.
itself to talk
Yeah,
about gender and
totally.
inclusivity, for sure. But I think it's just simple and not very challenging to just say person
Yeah.
or people.
And then followed by the particular biological thing that's happening, like menstruation, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I have a friend who identifies as a woman, is a biologically, was born female at birth, is a cis woman, but also can't menstruate. And
of
so,
course.
like there's this, and so people are, we're at one point starting to say, well, a woman, people who argue about it is like somebody who can menstruate, but like there's women, there's biological women who also can't menstruate or can't have
Of
children or like
course, who
all of
have
those things.
all, yeah, menopausal,
Yeah. Yeah.
have had surgeries, have
Yeah.
health issues,
Yeah.
and yeah, there's so much nuance, but I don't find that it's at all difficult to say person at this
Totally.
moment. Like,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I actually really love the language because I just love complexity,
mm,
and it makes me think of, right now I'm rereading James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, which basically goes
mm,
through and talks about like sort of the framework for how states sort of perceive and resources in the environment and then put them on a ledger, and everything has to be like super simplified and like overly
mm.
simplified to fit on a ledger for production and predictability of resource management, right? And so to have like multiple genders is like against the very, yeah, the
Ah!
state doesn't like that. It wants you to be male or female, right? And it hates
Yeah,
complexity, which to me, I love complexity. I think wildness is like embracing complexity.
yeah,
um and so I'm curious, like, if you want to speak at all to like how the state has alienated people or persons, specifically those that menstruate, from their own bodies and bodily processes, and what kind of how your work is about, revolves around that kind of education.
sure. Yeah, well, it is that reductionism, right? That idea that like a woman, and this is, using the overculture language on purpose, not my own language, but like
Totally.
the state being like, women are for making babies.
Yeah.
And it's like, capitalist, production oriented, like uteruses are 3D printers for making humans. When in reality, wombs do a lot more bleeding than birthing in their lifetimes in general, especially today. And it's really this conversation. It's like, it's not a metaphor. Like, our bodies are not a metaphor for the earth. They are
Totally.
part of the earth. And so we're
Yeah.
having this conversation of the difference between power over and power with, which is, kind of like the defining factor in rape culture and over culture, where the earth and people who menstruate, our bodies have been subjected to exploitation and ownership for what they can produce, right?
Totally.
For the way that we can create, like, attempt to create stasis. The history of the politics of marriage and the economics of marriage being about ownership of your progeny, in the way that ownership of land is about ownership of what the land can produce for, right, the male who
Totally.
is at the top of this pyramid, in this power over rather than power with conversation. And yeah, you recommended Sand Talk, which has become one of my favorite books I've read in years. And Tyson Yungaporta talks about how in Prussia, we had to report our menstrual cycles to the state, right? Because it's seen as a loss.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's no respect for the reality that all fertility, all fecundity comes out of death, and that the bleeding and the release and the fallow period of the land, all of these things are natural and important, necessary aspects of any sort of living cycle, which our bodies are part of. And the state, the overculture, has this desire to dominate and create production and create stasis and create, reproducible, provable methods of creating production, that is just completely antithetical to the way that
Right.
our bodies function.
Yeah. And ecosystems and all the things. Yeah.
Our bodies being the earth.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I'm German, so I feel like I'm allowed to talk shit about
Mm.
Germans, but no, I'm just
Ah,
kidding. But like some
yeah.
seriously horrible things came out of Prussia, compulsory education, the German forestry science. I mean, that's what he starts out seeing like a state by talking about like the forestry science where they were reducing ecosystems to board feet, you know, and the perception of
Yeah.
that. And it's just interesting how all of that stuff kind of came about in the same area from that same place. Like there's definitely like a sort of mechanistic thinking that
Yeah.
really was birthed out of there. I mean, you know, not to say that there wasn't momentum for that kind of stuff all over in different societies, but that a lot of the way that we perceive or the way the state functions came out of that area. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's profound. And it's just the self-hatred and the dissociation that that has created for people who menstruate, the expectation that we are going to have the same cognitive abilities, the same like motor skills every day of the week for 40 hours out of the week is just not, it's completely against our physiology. And, you know, folks who don't menstruate and don't have uteruses also have rhythms that change, but ours are quite dramatic in comparison. And the analogy of the 4 seasons in 4 weeks and the wheel of the year is one of my favorite teaching tools for that conversation that I think is what I want to, you know, teach all of the children.
I'm unfamiliar
And
with that actually. So yeah, when you mentioned that, I
yeah,
was like,
so
oh,
ovulation is the summer solstice and menstruation is the winter solstice in this analogy, in the same way that if we are going to overlay the moon cycle, the full moon would be ovulation and the dark moon would be menstruation. And they're these polar opposite energies that are in constant dynamic balance. There's no such thing as stasis. The minute you try and use language or, you know, your intellect to describe the moment that is happening in the cycle, that moment is already over. um, and, you know, like for the example of an apple tree through those seasons is one that I use to illustrate how absurd it is for somebody to be in the middle of winter yelling at an apple tree to produce apples.
right.
Like, who is the
Yeah.
idiot in
Right.
that moment?
Yeah.
It's the person, not the tree. And
Totally.
that really there's lots of data around it if you want to use the language of modern scientific data, which is an interesting language, but we also have thousands of years of energy, anatomy, and earth-based indigenous culture speaking to the wisdom of the menstrual cycle as a microcosm of the macrocosm of all creative energy. And that we need fallow periods, we need inwardness, we need darkness, we need rest, we need release, we need death to be a part of that integrated cycle, which again, coming back to this, like, how has the state, how has the overculture harmed us and created dissociation? It's like, we generally only honor summer. We only honor the productive yang energy. If we're going to look at yin and yang, it's the same thing with the yin yang. The most yang energy is our ovulatory energy. And even if we look at synthetic hormonal contraception, which 60% of our generation is using to suppress their ovulation, which is chemically trapping them in autumn, in late summer and
Interesting.
early
Yeah.
autumn, in that season analogy.
Yeah.
It's really a beautiful and synergistic analogy for monocropping
Mm-hmm. Totally.
and what monocropping is doing to the soil health. And again, with the data science, like PubMed has plenty of research and studies around the way that these synthetic hormonal contraceptive methods are deeply, deeply depleting our ability to absorb minerals. We can be eating the most perfect diet, but if we are not ovulating and producing natural progesterone, our body can't metabolize nutrition properly,
Wow.
and it's
Yeah.
depleting our bodies in the same way that monocropping is depleting the soil. And it's the similar concept
Totally.
of the overculture trying to create stasis
Yeah.
when a cycle is what is healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think one of my friends, Tamara Wilder, she started a
Yes.
Yeah, you're familiar with it. She started a
Yes,
group
we've met.
on the IUD and
Totally.
IUD awareness and how horrible the IUD is, basically, which I had never heard until I saw one of her posts on Facebook at one
Yeah.
point. And I
Yeah.
wonder how much that is that considered the same kind of, that's not a chemical, but it's a, there's all kinds of other things there too, like copper
There's
toxicity and
there's
stuff like
different
that.
types of IUDs. In fact, the one that Bayer makes, Bayer being Monsanto,
Yeah.
Bayer being who contracted with the Nazis to create all the gas for the gas chambers in the
Wow.
Holocaust, a corporation that never disincorporated, that paid, they paid reparations to the military industrial state of Israel, but never disincorporated.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, they make two different products that are the most commonly used. The Marina and the Skyla IUDs, which are synthetic hormonal IUDs. And then there's also a copper IUD. There's different products on the market. The hormonal ones, do have the synthetic hormones and are interrupting the mineral absorption. And the copper ones also fuck with our mineral levels in our body. As you can imagine, having a piece of metal inside of
Totally.
your
Yeah.
uterus
Right.
affects the ecosystem. And I use this term body ecology a lot when I
Hmm.
teach.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about contraception, to understand that we can respect the ecosystem of the body while avoiding pregnancy if we understand timing and dynamic balance and how to sensually, viscerally participate in the cycle rather than try and dominate and control it.
Yeah. So this kind of circles to another question, which is, I like the term family planning in terms of, I
Yeah,
think Planned Parenthood
it's
uses that a
nice.
lot too.
Yeah.
And it makes me just think about, couples' choices to have families or how that, or contraception or any of that kind of stuff, even adoption or anything like that. And I'm curious, um, what does family planning look like in past and present hunter-gatherer and or stateless societies?
Mm, yeah. And so, here we go into a little bit of, myth and cultural anthropology, because a lot of this is not written down, right? A lot of this was oral wisdom that was shared in ritual, in song, in rites of passage. And then in saying that, just highlighting the reality that for the vast majority of human history, our sexual and reproductive lives were social and spiritual processes that were not medicalized,
Mm-hmm.
and that the rise of the medicalization of our fertility and our pregnancies has a direct correlation and timeline and paper trail with the industrialization of agriculture, which again is like news to a lot of people. It's like, it's not that
Totally.
it hasn't been happening for that long. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
um, so I guess I first just want to throw out there that like there's good evidence that folks who are menstruating created the first calendars,
Mm. Mm. I mean, that makes
and
sense.
that was, yeah, our
Hmm.
relationship with the moon, which, when I first learned about that as a young woman, I was like, oh, it's this like celestial, magical, amazing, mythological thing. And then, lo and behold, there are, Harvard done studies around the way that light exposure affects
Interesting.
melatonin and
Yeah.
the pituitary hypothalamus axis, which then governs our ovarian function.
Hmm.
So, it's yes, and it's the science
Sure.
and the spirit.
So
But there's
artificial light then can change the
also,
cycle.
yeah,
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay.
100%. And yeah, that it
Interesting.
was normal that we would bleed with that dark moon and ovulate with the light moon. Light stimulates ovulation.
Mm. Okay. Fascinating.
Um, yeah, yeah. And so that's also a therapeutic process for folks that are struggling with irregular cycles, is to be really careful about sleeping in total darkness, turning off all electronics. And then if you don't have access to lunar light, then put on a night light when it's the full moon.
Mm.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests we have always planned our families and our reproduction in synergy with our ecosystems, with our access to calories, with our plans for traveling, and that was something that we had the power and ability to do.
Mm-hmm.
That it was not an external authority of any sort that was like giving us access, that we were able to use our consciousness, and really, and that's like another, I have like little side note. I think you and Sophie touched on sensory gating, and I strongly believe that part of what we have lost in our ability to manage our fertility as a culture is because of that sensory gating.
Totally.
And that we could actually feel our fertility, which we still can if we're taught correctly. There's studies, 90% of us can correctly identify our fertile fluids in our first cycle if we're given proper education.
Wow.
And, we're all taught like you need a sperm and an egg to make a baby, but you don't. You need a sperm, an egg, and fertile fluids, which are only around for about 3 to 6 days out of the entire cycle, right?
Yeah,
So the springtime in that seasonal, that seasonal analogy. So, yeah, we knew how to plan, and infanticide was a lot more normalized. It was not as demonized if we couldn't handle the children we had. If there weren't enough resources, there's a lot more infanticide historically. And then there's a lot of evidence also that it was not even considered a pregnancy until there was what they called the quickening, when you could feel kicking from the baby, which is usually deep into the second trimester. And anything that you would do before that baby was kicking to bring on your period was simply restoring your menstrual cycle. And that's language that even Ben Franklin is using in his almanacs, where he has herbal abortion recipes.
Wow.
Because it's basic homesteading skills to be able to manage the fertility of both your body and the land.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't realize Benjamin Franklin had that. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow. So weird.
Well, and again, just to highlight that it wasn't considered a child. Like literally that concept is part of neoliberal modern ideology, and that anything done to bring on your menstrual cycle, for majority of what we have in written history, was described as bringing on a late menses or the returning of the natural courses. And there's no conversation, or very little conversation, about an abortion.
Interesting.
It's just stimulating menstruation, which is again a natural, normal thing to do, to menstruate.
Totally. Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the subject of, the taboo subjects like infanticide and like, anthropophagy, or as it's called commonly, cannibalism. Like these kinds of things like fascinate me. And I'm really interested. I haven't gone down sort of the rabbit hole of infanticide, but I'm super curious because, you have this like notion of today of like we're allegedly pro-life people or anti-choice people have this notion of like, conception is the moment of conception is the beginning of life or whatever, right? But then you have indigenous people that, and people in our past who don't think of that at all. Like some cultures don't even name their kids until they're like 2 years old.
Yep.
And that's their like birth, right? There's like when they get their name in a sense.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting to think about the way that we perceive of life and the way we grieve about certain things too, right? So, I mean, I imagine like, people are like, oh, it's so horrible that they would kill a baby or something, right? But if you have a whole cultural context around how you perceive that and how to grieve with it collectively, you have a container that makes it something that is just normalized and not like evil or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not like people are gaining pleasure out of it, but it's also not the end of the world, right? So I'm
Sure.
just, I'm fascinated by that entire concept, but sort of a tangent, but interrelated.
No, I mean, it's the comfort with death,
Mm, mm-hmm.
that it is part of life, and that there's only so much resource available, and that also just, I like to emphasize the reality that some level of abortion exists in every single species on the
Oh.
planet,
Mm.
and that it's not a uniquely human process, and that our psyches are in fact part of nature, not separate from nature, and that every single living organism will begin a reproductive cycle and end it prior to coming to full fruition when the resources and the environment are not ideal or adequate, and that our emotional and psycho-spiritual resources are just as real as our
Mm.
caloric and
Mm.
physical resources
Mm. Mm-hmm.
to bring a child into the world, and to just really normalize this as not a uniquely human process,
Totally.
but part of nature.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. So on your website, you had this term abortion doula that I thought was interesting and
Do
cool.
I?
I don't know, maybe it wasn't on your website. I
I was
thought
like,
I saw it
I
on your
doubt
stuff.
it.
I don't know why I would have added it to my notes. Maybe you posted about it on social media or something, but I was like, that's an
Yeah,
interesting, it stuck out to me. So I added it to my notes in terms of something to talk about.
yeah,
So what is that? If
yeah.
it,
Well, so I did use the term abortion doula, but it's been about, I want to say, 6 years since I have identified as such. The word doula is from the ancient Greek. It essentially means slave,
mm,
slave girl or servant
oh,
girl.
wow.
And
That's
the
right.
role would be like a chambermaid who would be taking away the fluids from a wealthy woman.
Wow.
So the profession of a doula is something that has emerged in the 1980s, uh, to fill a gap, to address a wound, within our culture, with the reality that most people do not have friends or family members that understand how pregnancy and pregnancy relief occur and how to help. And
Mm,
so
mm-hmm.
the it's been adopted. There's now certifications and trainings and protocols and license, like there's a whole industry. There are some really beautiful, wonderful, amazing doulas in the world, but by and large, I believe that the vast majority of the process of creating a professional sector, and protocols and certifications around this has actually taken
Mm,
power from the collective.
yeah, that makes sense.
Um, so, an abortion doula would be somebody who can provide emotional and practical and information support for somebody before, during, and after an abortion, in a similar way to the way one would provide doula care in a birth of a baby before, during, and after. And that was my primary professional identity for the entirety of my 20s while I lived in Portland. Was I was primarily a birth doula, and I was always helping people with abortions and miscarriages. And eventually somebody was like, hey, I need to pay you to come to my abortion.
Mm, mm,
And I was like, wait, oh yeah, I do have like 15 years of experience
mm,
doing this. And this
mm,
was like, is a very valuable thing. And so I took all of my birth protocols, the worksheets, the intentions, uh, and I transferred it over to abortion care.
that's
Um,
awesome.
but really, all of this is traditional midwifery. Etymologically, midwife is just somebody who is with women.
Mm,
Again, conjugate with people who have wombs.
totally.
And I use the term pregnancy release to describe any type of a pregnancy process, no matter how it ends.
Mm,
There is a gestative holding, there is a birthing and a release, and there's a postpartum period. And whether someone's having a baby or an abortion or a miscarriage or a stillbirth, they deserve companionship, they deserve care, and somebody who's knowledgeable and experienced in that area, which could be a doula today. And I, again, like, I don't use that term anymore
Right.
because
No,
of the way that
exactly.
it's been just deeply appropriated and
Yeah.
commodified. So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Well, it kind of ties into to sort of the next question. I mean, not it's sort of interrelated, but um, I look online and I see different people sort of marketing different things, and for me, certain things, like, and this harkens to the meme I made, right? That was sort of mocking some of the people and the way that they go about marketing rewilding for whatever demographic it is that they're serving or
Sure.
claiming to serve. And to me, there's this sort of interesting thing of like looking at somebody's thing and trying to suss out whether or not. I don't want to use the word authentic. It's hard for me to even find language around this. Like, an expert, like profession, like there's just so many different words. But is somebody just, and I don't want to say psychopath or narcissist or whatever. Like, there's just too much kind of going on. Like, I want to know, who is doing work that is systemic and who is doing work that is just straight up superficial and selling a thing, right? Like like there's people like the person I mentioned that does the rewilding for women,
Mm.
TM trademark.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I feel like I have friends who actually took some of her stuff and they enjoyed it, right? And so there's this
Hmm.
level of like, but to me, looking at it, it just seems so empty on the inside. Like it feels very superficial. And I'm of course,
Yeah.
I'm judging it from the outside. It's the same with lots of different other people that are using the word rewild to describe all kinds of things, right? But there's
Mm-hmm.
this element of you know, even things that are superficial can be treating symptoms, right? So like there's this thing if everybody might be
Mm.
marketing like, here's how we can help you with these symptoms, or they're identifying what they think is a problem. But once the sort of, and you could have like a painkiller, right? So you take this person's workshop and you're like, I loved it. Why are you criticizing them? And it's like, well, because it was just a painkiller. Like it didn't actually
Mm.
change the thing that's causing your pain. It just was a
Yeah.
painkiller. And when that painkiller wears off, you're just gonna have to buy another one, take another one, because this person's not doing any actual systemic work.
Yeah.
And to me, there's like, people prey on it, right? It's like a social media, multi-level marketing, blah, blah, blah. There's like people who prey on it. And I'm wondering like if you have advice or thoughts on like how to identify and seek out people who are actually doing something on a systemic level. And they may not have like the
Mm.
accreditation of the scientific institution or a degree from the, academic institution. In fact, it might be the inverse, right? Where some of those people who do have those degrees are some of the people that I'm talking about, which are, selling essentially not necessarily snake oils, because there is a placebo effect, or maybe the medicine does help treat a symptom on some level, but people who are
Yeah.
not doing a systemic transformation.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that really just comes to mind is lineage, is folks that are actually able to name and acknowledge lineages that are not just institutions giving them permission and
Totally.
validation. Um, and yeah, I myself have no credentials
Either.
whatsoever. I'm a
Yeah.
lifelong
Yeah.
student. I
Me
started
too.
studying when I was 11.
Hmm.
And on my website and in every single workshop I will lead, I will name my teachers and the lineage of the ideas that I am sharing. And then the other thing is like, it sounds kind of trite, but it's like ego versus eco.
Mm.
It's kind of what
Hmm.
comes up for
Hmm.
me, right? Is like, is it, you can taste, you can smell, like you can sense, like, is this ego driven or is this ecologically
Mm.
sound, right? Does this actually take into account the systemic
Mm.
issues? And the lineage is part of the ecosystem because it's acknowledging what nourished you and the environment and the context in which your ideas and your skills grew. And yeah, it's especially when it comes to herbal medicine and womb care and things like that, like we've been uncredentialed and persecuted by the church and state
Totally.
forever. So
Totally.
anybody who like is validated and has permission from those institutions, I would actually be a little
Questionable.
circumspect
Right. Yeah.
to begin. And it's really interesting. Yeah, when I was practicing as a birth doula, none of my clients ever asked me if I was certified.
Mm,
But my colleagues would regularly be like, "Who did you train with? Who did you
mm,
certify with?" And I'm just
mm,
like,
mm.
I've avoided credentials at every step of the way because I think it's a human right to have access
Totally. Yeah.
to this information and to
Yeah.
share it. And I don't actually agree with the ethics or the protocols of any of the credentialing systems out there
Exactly.
or need their permission to know what I know or do what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, a long time ago, I never published it, but I started writing an essay kind of about this, and it was called something like "Grandmas, Not Gurus," and
Oh, love it.
made me think of I think one of the things on there was the lineage thing. Yeah, so
Yeah.
like it's I hate the expression red flag, but when I'm looking at somebody's
Mm,
bio and they have zero references to their
these are
teachers,
my teachers. Yeah.
yeah, that's like the biggest red flag for me is like
Yeah.
how did you get to this place, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
There's a quote that I share a lot. I actually include it in the intro to a lot of my workshops also, which is from Barbara Ehrenreich and Deidre English in Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, which is just, we must never confuse professionalism with expertise. Expertise is something to work for and share. Professionalism is by definition elitist and exclusive,
mm,
sexist, racist, and classist.
totally. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see here. So I guess,
Mm.
yeah, kind of circling back to sort of the family planning aspect of hunter-gatherer societies, what is
Yeah, yeah.
conscious contraception and how do people practice it today and how they practiced it throughout history, prehistory, etc.?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say again because so much of it was oral history. We can definitely say with a lot of confidence that plant medicine was used to manage our fertility for the majority of human history. Our modern day synthetic hormonal contraceptions, in fact, were inspired by indigenous women in what is now Oaxaca, Mexico. The
Huh.
Chinantec women were using wild yam root, which is a progesterone moderator. And progesterone is, I like to teach and speak of it as the progestation hormone. It has many, many other qualities.
Amazing.
It's
Is
really,
that
really
really
good
the
anti.
etymology of it?
No,
Oh, okay, but it's awesome that it
no,
does
but
that.
it works.
Yeah, that's so
And
cool.
so most of the plant medicines that are used to modulate to manage our fertility, and I use the term fertility management to describe both contraception and abortion. Most of the plant medicines that are used historically are things that will affect our progesterone levels in various ways. And, it's not mysterious. Today, we can really break it down into the biochemistry of specific hormones and things like this. And so I think historically, so there's a lot more of that lack of sensory gating in terms of our visceral awareness of the body, of our fertility cycles, their relationships with the moon and the earth and the plant medicines, and how those all intermingle into ecological systems that we are part of, right? Instead of dominating, we're moving in dynamic balance with those systems. um, but today I use the term conscious contraception to describe a mind, body, and spirit approach to avoiding pregnancy without needing to consume goods or services from the medical industrial complex, unless there's urgent outlying
Mhm.
situations. I'm not I am not at all part of like dualistic us, them, good, bad, evil, like conversations at all. I think that, the medical industrial complex has some really useful goods and services when we are actually able to be conscious consumers and have choice
Totally.
to consume them consensually. However, we can avoid pregnancy simply by being conscious of the texture of the fluids in our vaginas
Yeah.
and on the face of our vulvas, and then communicating that to our partners and having actual consensual experiences with them, which again is like, we have to end rape culture for that to be fully possible. But yeah, I use the term conscious contraception. I don't know of people that were using it prior to my, popularizing it. And it's basically fertility awareness method of some sort, which there are many different nuanced, tiny little rules where you learn your three primary fertility signals: fluids, cervical texture and position, and temperature are the three primary fertility signals. And you learn them, you observe them, and then you actually embody your desire. You embody your intention, and you have consensual, conscious sexual interactions with people who are also embodying your desire to avoid pregnancy and willing and able to put their sperm where it should go, which is
Right.
anywhere
Yeah.
besides inside of a vagina is
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
So did I lose that thread? Yeah, but then I think that there's like a really significant psychospiritual aspect to it as well. There's physiology, which is everybody deserves to understand the basic fertility signals and the reality that we don't need to consume goods or services from anybody in order. It's literally just don't put sperm in your vagina when you have fertile fluids there and you will not get pregnant. It's really, we're talking about a week out of the month.
Yeah.
And really acknowledging that if you cannot abstain from sperm in a vagina for a week out of the month, or that your relationship is dependent upon your partner's access to ejaculating in you, or your definition of sex is a penis in a vagina until it ejaculates, then there are some bigger cultural issues and abuses at hand here. But that literally our sensual and intellectual abilities to feel our bodies and communicate and embody our desires are what we need to be able to avoid pregnancy without altering the ecosystem of our endocrine system, without inserting inanimate objects into our uteruses, without producing waste. And, we could talk about open relationships and polyamory and the importance of safer sex is a whole other conversation. But with two folks that are fluid bonded, that again, it's like, you don't need to consume anything or create any waste.
Right. Like
Or ask
condoms
anybody
or any of that
permission.
kind of, yeah, yeah.
It's not necessary.
Right.
You can if you want to. I want to, absolutely, if that is your choice and your desire, and that's how you would prefer to do it. But that we all deserve the education, the knowledge, and the skills to know that we are not dependent upon being consumers of any goods or services to effectively avoid pregnancy. And that if there's an oops, plants are really wonderful allies for bringing on menses. And I've never, ever seen them fail when you work with them before you miss a period. And that's what my book, Please Bleed, Plants and Practical Magic, is all about.
Awesome. Nice plug.
So that was a pretty long-winded,
yeah. That was great. No,
spiralic
that was totally what I
answer
was.
to what is conscious contraception.
Yeah.
But I also I've been doing also another deep dive. It's really soothing for me and my brain to see the context. And so since Roe has been overturned, I've been doing another deep dive of research and digging into the history of contraception and abortion. And I didn't actually fully know when I published that book, that is really the precedent in terms of the language, right? So most of our fertility management practices were given in ritual, given in song, given in oral traditions. But from what we do have in writing, most of the writing is about promoting menstruation.
Yeah.
Instead of causing an abortion.
Totally.
And
Yeah,
that the
that's amazing.
recipes for promoting menstruation are what we would call today herbal abortion recipes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is
It's
a
so
really
weird.
sweet moment of just like
Mm-hmm.
having consciousness beyond my
Mm-hmm.
individual consciousness, of being part of that collective lineage, which
Mm-hmm.
is really comforting, that like my book is fucking called Please Bleed.
Yeah.
And that is like
Yeah.
most of the written history in medical texts from ancient times, from Egypt,
Yeah.
like all over, is just like promoting bleeding.
I feel like I have a question that kind of comes into that, which is I feel like at one point in some book or in some, somewhere you hear these things and they kind of, you file them away and think about them off and on. But I feel like at one point I heard something about how like hunter gatherers, didn't really have regular menstruation because they
Sure,
would get pregnant and then, breastfeed for 4 years or something to
totally.
prevent pregnancy. So how does that relate to that notion? And is that really true? Is it like a
Yeah,
culture?
thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
That is, I think it's legit. Yeah, if you have enough prolactin in your system, you're not going to ovulate. And what that looks like for most people is that if you breastfeed every 4 hours, you probably won't ovulate. And so if you're breastfeeding every 4 hours for several years, then you're not going
Yeah.
to ovulate.
Yeah.
And that is a natural way to, again, and it's like, again, it's about the ecosystem, which includes your bone marrow
Hmm.
and your caloric and mineral ability for creating an entire another human. And that if you're feeding a human with your body, it's probably not the best time to create an entirely other human with the body.
Yeah.
So
It
yes,
also, I mean, but it also kind of feels like I mean, it seems like it gives agency to hunter gatherers who menstruate, but at the same time, it's like it also feels like it still has this sort of vibe of like um, that they were maybe not necessarily aware of all of the other things they could have been doing for contraception too. Like
sure.
it just seems kind of like a weird thing where I heard that something like that. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. But then at the same time, it's like, I mean, I'm sure they were doing all kinds of other things too. Like,
People do that still today. We shouldn't actually just, it's not just in antiquity. Like
totally.
plenty of people today breastfeed in order as their form of contraception as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And that's ovulation suppression, which we getting into actually the details of the language, I think is really important and healthy.
Mm,
And that,
mm,
most of these synthetic forms of contraception are in fact ovulation suppression, which sure, okay, that's contraception because it's countering conception. But I think that it's actually more helpful to say ovulation suppression,
hmm.
because there's no chance of the sperm meeting the egg when you're not ovulating.
Totally.
Right. And so actually like teaching, like what I had like a whole rap song that was a parody to
That's
Naughty by
awesome.
Nature's OPP that
Nice.
I used to do. Like, needs to be like, you down with OPP? And it's like, no, not me. It was like the ovulation prevention pill.
Nice. That's awesome.
um, which just, it's just coming to me. And I want to throw out that
Mm.
like in the modern data science research realm, which is so entertaining, right? Uh, there's a correlation between one of the hormones that creates ovulation, the luteinizing hormone that spikes during that fertile window, and what they call divergent thinking. So nonlinear, out of the box
Mm.
sort of thinking that
Mm.
is not obvious.
Mm.
Divergent creative thinking peaks with
Interesting.
this spike of hormone that is in the fertile
Yeah.
window
Huh.
that is being suppressed in the vast majority of people who could potentially be ovulating.
Mm. Yeah.
It's
Wow.
pretty profound.
It's amazing all the things that happen inside the body and that,
Yeah,
anyway.
it is amazing. I feel like I lost one of the threads you wanted to pick up, but I'm glad you brought up breastfeeding. And yeah, I think there's a lot less need for contraception for most of human history because of the shorter spans and breastfeeding. And then there's also some records that I'm a fan of in terms of ideas that we watched the animals
Mm,
and what they consumed, the plant medicines that the animals
mm,
consumed. Like there's a certain type of clover that some flock
mm,
in
hmm.
Ireland would eat and be infertile. Or
Interesting.
there's
Yeah.
other plants that the animals would go and eat after giving birth
Mm,
to
hmm.
promote the placenta being birthed, that second stage of
Mm,
labor,
mm.
that there was a certain plant that they would always go eat in order to make sure that the uterus released the
Interesting.
placenta.
Yeah.
And that uh, also just really highlighting that contraception, abortion are points on the womb continuum, on the continuum of womb health. They are not isolated. And that if we understand how to work with plants to avoid or end pregnancy effectively, then we can also understand how to encourage and support healthy menstruation and how to encourage and support healthy childbirth and
Mm,
postpartum
mm.
periods and menopause, and that these are not different plants or different biochemical actions. They're the same plants being used in with different intentions at
Yeah.
different timings and different
Yeah.
dosage. And so it's to really integrate and not isolate this wisdom.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Shifting gears a little bit, and kind of circling back to the meme. I'm curious
Mm.
what your, what are your constructive criticisms that you would have, for the sort of wild woman motif that we see oftentimes mostly on social media.
I think we already really spoke about it,
Cool.
the eco versus ego and lineage. Like the propensity for appropriation that I see,
Mm,
the
mm,
aesthetic and ego driven, what does it look like versus like where did it come from? Like what
mm,
is it rooted
mm.
into? Like what are the resources that we are um like how are you resourced? Like where is this energy and this power coming from? And is it from an ego and image and ego based projection, or is it actually rooted in an ecological, like lineage rooted tradition?
Yeah.
um and yeah, and just fucking learn how to tell when you ovulate.
Mm.
This is like, that is one of my pet peeves, honestly, from the wild woman, like goddess, divine feminine world that I have been adjacent to or like been associated with for so long, is that there's this like huge celebration of the red tent and of bleeding and menstruation and how sacred and important that is, that is completely removed from ovulation and
Huh.
understanding the fertile window
Mm.
and the ovulatory cycle, and that actually the menstrual cycle, the whole point of the menstrual cycle is ovulation.
Right.
Like ovulation is the queen
Hmm.
bee, and like that's something that I was, just talking to an 11-year-old about as I was sharing my coloring book with her, and her mom
Mm.
was like, well, she hasn't started menstruating yet. And I was like, yeah, well, she'll ovulate first, because actually ovulation comes
Totally.
before
Right.
menstruation.
Yeah.
And so understanding that menstruation comes after ovulation, and that that is actually like what the body is working towards, and the menstrual cycle is to support the ovulatory cycle. And again, that it's not that hard
Mm.
to learn how to tell when you ovulate. And there's so many psycho spiritual and social benefits beyond conceiving and gestating a baby, that ovulatory power has so much value,
Mm.
in terms of the way that it affects our mineral digestion, our cognition, our creativity, our verbal and motor skills. Like there's so many reasons being aware of the fertile phase and ovulation is useful besides even worrying about any sort of sexual contact or sperm, and that is like, yeah, the
Yeah.
counterpoint.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you
Thanks.
already sort of answered this too, but
Mm.
you can maybe use this as an opportunity to plug some of your other stuff. But we're entering, we're in a collapsing system, or we're in a, as far as the United States and global civilization, we're in a decline. Some places are collapsing faster. I like to sort of
Yeah.
differentiate between decline and collapse. Decline being sort of the long collapse, collapse being those moments that happen immediately, or 10 years or something.
Yeah.
The shorter declines, or the steeper declines, I think more of as um, collapses. But as that intensifies, what
Hmm.
resources would you recommend for people, and why?
Yeah, in the realm, I mean, like specifically in the realm of fertility management, I'm
Totally.
guessing.
Yes.
Um,
Your wheelhouse.
I'm like, let get some guns and antibiotics.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Well, those things are important too.
anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, learning the basic physiology of how to manage our fertility without consuming from the medical industrial complex, assuming that supply chains are not going to be what they are currently. Um, and understanding that we're able to enjoy robust and healthy, pleasurable sex lives without being reliant on consuming goods and services from corporations that don't share ethics, or relying upon professionals to provide us with services that we are able to care for ourselves and one another with. So yeah, I will plug my courses. They're not the only source. There are many other sources of this information out there, but my conscious contraception Skillshare um, teaches you how to avoid pregnancy without consuming goods and services. And my miscarriage and abortion support course moves through both in and out of clinic processes, and is a really good way to become familiar with home care and the physiology of how to release a pregnancy safely at home, whether by chemical or mechanical means, and learning the difference between that and the different ages of gestation. I mean, there's a lot of nuance there, of course. Like we could, again, like record an entire other
Totally.
podcast simply about pregnancy release. Um, but, oof, yeah, like just learning about the physiology and not relying on external authority or supply chains, understanding, again, as I said before, like some of those goods and services are very, very helpful. But really about 90-95% of abortions can be happening safely at home if people had the correct education and
Yeah.
support systems in place. Like
Amazing.
there are very few that we actually, like, we don't need medical attention for most fertility and pregnancy experiences. Like obviously there are situations where we do, but even the World Health Organization for normal childbirth says it should be less than 5% of births that require any medical intervention. And abortion is actually much safer than
Hmm.
birth
I mean,
in
it makes
terms
sense.
of, yes, in
Yeah.
terms of the like development of the maternal blood network and how to manage a release. Again, just respecting that the womb has an innate wisdom for how to release.
Mm.
And anytime that we come in with any sort of tool or support, that we should be coming in with the perspective that we are supporting a natural process rather than interrupting one.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
That out of all of our conceptions, about 70% of them don't even implant. And then after implantation happens, about 1 in 5 will pass in the first 5 weeks. 1 in 4 pregnancies are aborted globally,
Wow.
approximately. And so about half of pregnancies don't end in babies.
Yeah.
And again, just like my courses are really great intros. They're available by donation. Since Roe was overturned, I just took away all the price points and just made a big leap of faith and was just like, okay, guys, this is here for you. I'm going to trust that people that can pay me for this will pay me, and people that cannot will pay it forward. But then I also have, yes, an online learning community where you can drop in and actually have a discussion with me and ask me questions as you study. And that's called the Fruit of Knowledge Learning Community, inspired by Lilith, and the snake and the primordial fertility goddess. What if it was an original win instead of an original
That's
sin?
awesome. Nice.
The original win.
Yeah.
And then also just being an etymology geek and the Hebrew scriptures, the term knowledge that is used to describe that fruit is also used for sex. So
interesting. Yeah.
It's sexual knowledge.
Yeah.
And yeah, resources beyond my own. A New View of a Woman's Body that was written by the Federation of Feminist Women's Health Centers. Again, it's very gendered. It's first wave feminism, but there's very explicit information about how to stay out of the gynecologist office, including instructions for menstrual extraction. I also have a spelunking with speculums and menstrual extraction lesson available in my learning community. Familiarizing yourself with plant medicine and menstrual extraction primarily as far as home release care goes, to just learn some of the basic physiology. I will stop. I know I'm like rambling. But amenagog, right? Like my book, Please Bleed, Plants and Practical Magic, like developing a relationship with amenagogs if you're somebody who can get pregnant. Just sitting with plants, figuring out who's in your neighborhood, and developing an intimate relationship when you're not in an emergent state, I think is really, really vital. And to understand that these plants are sentient beings, and to just come to them when you're in a panic to try and create an abortion is really disrespectful. So I highly recommend that folks who want to have plants available as allies for fertility management develop an intimate and cyclical relationship where they're working with them and communing with them and sitting with them cyclically. So just taking a small dose for a couple of days before you bleed, and the first couple of days when you do bleed, growing them in your garden or in a pot in your kitchen. And I will, one more thought. Well,
oh, you're breaking up a little bit.
Just that the folks that I have supported who had, oh, you are too. The internet has decided the conversation's over.
Yeah.
I'm back.
You're back.
Yeah. Maybe it's just like the natural, like, okay, Sam, that was enough. That was enough of that. And yeah, I have extensive resource lists also in my learning community if folks do want to learn from me, but there are certainly other sources in the world. Happy to point you to those too.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what questions do you have for me?
Oh yeah. Let me pull up the document. I'm really delighted that I introduced you to the 4 seasons in 4 weeks analogy. And yeah, my question was like, do you think that we could teach this to kids in your program?
Yes. Short answer.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, overall, I just feel like contraception and abortion should be honored as survival skills.
Totally. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, for me, there's like, I hate the term survival skills. I use like ancestral technology, because survival is definitely like for a specific context. Like our ancestors weren't walking around in a constant state of survival, right? Exactly. Yeah. You know, but yeah, survival skills, ancestral skills, absolutely 100%, you know, people, all the things that we know about our bodies and can learn from them, and how we integrate into the ecologies of our space, and blah, blah, blah.
And of like all genders as well.
Right. Totally.
Like that is something that I'm super passionate about, that like all genders of all 8-year-olds should just be given this, like,
Totally.
hey, here's how it
Yes.
works.
Yeah, yeah, not
Um,
like this weird sex education thing they do in middle school, where they separated the boys and the girls and like took them to like each learn about other parts or whatever their own, but it's just so weird. Like that whole thing is just so bizarre. Oh man. Anyway, am I breaking up?
yeah, and so that's my one of my other questions
Yeah.
is just like, what do you think are ideas or feeling states that we can use to motivate people with sperm to be fully responsible, right? The response able
Mm-hmm.
to the reality that y'all are fertile like every day.
Yeah.
And our bodies, again, with this 4 seasons and 4 weeks analogy, like there's only a season that we are fertile. Like, how do we motivate the people with sperm to be responsible for fertility management?
Yeah, I mean,
How do we make it sexy?
yeah, yeah. That's a good question. How to make it sexy. I mean, to me, there's a lot going on in there, right? I mean, it makes me think of like the notion of rape culture, and I think like at one point there was a really great article circling around that was like, how do we go from rape culture to nurturance culture or nurture culture or something
Yeah,
like that? And I think that there's definitely like uh, at least in my from my perspective with rewilding of looking at sex in general as just sort of like you were saying earlier, does it have to be like penis and vagina penis ejaculating inside of a vagina, right? Like no, in the same way that like you know the state wants to simplify everything. To me that's like an oversimplification of sex, right? And so I think that there's like how to make it sexy is to embrace sex positivity or just like sexual um, diversity in terms of like the
yeah,
kinds of sex that we can have, right? And then also being very communicative with our partners around all of that stuff, like people being
yeah.
aware of their fertility and communicating that, and making sure to ask, but also just like
Yes.
consent all along the way. Obviously I feel like
Mhm.
that's like number one.
Yeah.
um and yeah, I mean, I think to me that's where it ends. Although I produce sperm, I got a vasectomy, so I don't, I'll
Mazel
never.
tov.
I
With
regret
the
it.
metal or without?
I think it was without. I think they tied off. They cut and tied
Cauterize.
my
My
vas
partner
deferens.
is
Yeah,
in the middle of researching,
yeah.
trying to
I
find
wish
insurance
I
that will
had
cover.
not done it, but
Really?
yeah, I wish I had not done it. In the same way that there are, lots of people that have complications with IUDs.
Oh,
Vasectomies are actually not safe the way that they say they are. There's a
wow.
thing you can get called post vasectomy pain syndrome. Again, it's like anytime
Mm,
you're cutting up the body, it's going to have
yeah.
unknown repercussions. And so yeah, the most recent study that came out that was a meta-analysis said that around 7% of men get post vasectomy pain syndrome, which is something that can come years after the vasectomy. It can come on right afterward. It can come and
Okay.
go. It can the pain itself can vary dramatically.
Yeah.
For me, it's been really or was severe. I'm like very thankful that it's like waned a bit, but there's sort of sometimes it's just pain in my groin area, like just for no reason. Other times it
Mm,
happens with arousal and stuff like that. So I would recommend, and Planned Parenthood doesn't even have post vasectomy pain syndrome like on their website. Like if you
of
did a search,
course
it wouldn't
not.
even be on there. And I'm happy that Planned Parenthood does a lot of services, and at the same time, there's lots of criticisms that I could vault their
My
way
parents
as well.
totally fucked.
I know.
One, I want to just thank you so much for sharing that. And two, I want to just throw this analogy out there for Planned Parenthood. Like I worked there for years and
Mm,
I know like the inner workings
mm.
and there's a lot there. Emma Goldman also being one of my ancestral like soul political
Hmm.
mentors who like Margaret Sanger and Emma Goldman actually had like direct conflict. Sanger threw her under the bus. Anyway, um, Yeah, Planned Parenthood has quotas on prescriptions the way that cops have quotas on speeding tickets.
Wow.
And specifically, they are pharmaceutically like the Mirena IUD, a piece of plastic that secretes synthetic hormones into people's uteruses. Like they had to prescribe a certain number of those to get their funding,
Wow.
right? Which is not a beacon for choice.
Yeah.
It's not a place you go
Yeah.
for choice when they have to insert a piece of plastic that
Totally.
secretes synthetic hormones.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, thank you for sharing that you do not recommend vasectomy.
I mean, everybody's going to do
Everybody's
what
body's so
they can do,
unique.
right? But
Yeah,
the most people don't know that it's, such a high percentage. Essentially, like almost 1 in 10 men will get post
that's a
vasectomy pain
lot.
syndrome, which is a lot. And
Well,
the
and it's
rates could be
again,
way higher, right? And then that's the thing. Like one of the
yeah,
studies showed 15% of men, but the meta-analysis was only like 7%. But
yeah,
the thing is, the more men that are getting them, because more and more men are getting them,
yeah.
there's more and more feedback coming back around this topic, right? But this meta-analysis was done in 2019, and I got mine in 2020 and had no idea that it was, that there was a potential for that really, because I trusted Planned Parenthood. I trusted that
Whoa.
the pamphlet that I got that said this was safe
Oh,
was,
yeah.
was that it was going to be safe. And then when I actually experienced pain and went back to them, basically the surgeon was like, just take ibuprofen before you have sex, but essentially like be a man kind of a thing, right? So then
Oh.
I didn't go back, and then like a fucking year later, I was like still in excruciating pain, and ended
Mm.
up, calling them and was like, I am in excruciating pain now. Like this is super fucked up. It's just been getting worse. Like what do I do? And they were basically like, you waited too long to really let us know about this, so there's nothing we can do now. So it's just
Well,
like, yeah, so that I've got a sore spot for from that, literally and
literally.
and figuratively speaking, but I'm doing a lot better now. I think in part, just inflammation in the body can do all kinds of things. So I got
Oh,
my
yeah.
my vaccines for COVID definitely increased
Flared
inflammation
it.
in my body, and
Hmm.
then I also got a tetanus vaccination, and another, just a bunch of other stuff, kind of all around that same time period. So thankfully, yeah, it's gone away. But they can do a reversal, which is like 70% effective. Unfortunately, there is a
Hmm.
30% chance that even with a reversal, then you'll still just be in pain.
Did you, when you got your vasectomy, did you fully understand fertility awareness science as a practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a thing that I know is a thing. But
Yeah.
it has to do then with your partner and their interest and desire to actually,
Yeah,
or partners, to participate in that.
totally.
And for me, it was just kind of easier in my mind to just
Uh-huh.
never have to think about it for myself, and take my own autonomy and not have to be super worried about the other person making sure that they were paying attention to those things. If I could just take care
Yeah.
of it myself, which again, it's like, being responsible. I thought that was sort of my choice, but now I think, knowing what I know now,
Yeah.
experiencing what I've experienced, I wish I would have been better informed, and I think I might have, I might have just chosen to actually been more of an advocate for my partner and partners, potential other partners, for whatever,
Yeah.
to be more conscious of that. But
Yeah.
um, yeah. So I think that's one thing that people who produce sperm can do absolutely, is encourage those who menstruate and can get pregnant in whatever capacity to become aware of their fertility in that way.
In a loving way. I mean, I think I just, again, the analogy of the four seasons is just so good.
Yeah,
You gotta dress for the weather.
totally.
Like,
Yeah.
like if you are sleeping, if you're being sexual with somebody who has a cycle and menstruates, like their body needs to be treated like the weather system that you
Totally.
are living inside of.
Yeah,
And you, like, why would you try and manipulate the weather? There's no bad weather, there's only bad gear.
totally. Yes, exactly.
And I love you saying that we need to, decentering penis and vagina sex until penis ejaculates, and like not defining that as sex, I think is so important.
Totally.
And for folks who make sperm to be able to actually experience the full range of erotic intimacy that is not that one act,
Right.
then it doesn't seem like such a shitty thing that you have to abstain from that one act for maybe
Totally.
a week
Right.
out of
Yeah.
the month. Just,
Yeah.
which again, you can
Yeah.
just like, what a fun time to explore kink and other, like
Totally.
all sorts of other
Yeah.
fun things. Like it
Yeah.
shouldn't be like a problem. It should be like, oh, we
Exactly.
got to be really creative now this
Totally.
week. That's
Yes.
just like, that's off the
Yes.
table.
Yeah.
Let's make a fun list of all the other things that we could do.
Is there anything else that you're like, oh, I have to say this, or, have you feel like you've said the things that you came to say, or is there any like last word that you're like, oh, I should say this thing
Mm,
because, or are we good?
I feel like we're good. I will just restate again that it's not a metaphor, that our bodies are the earth, and that the dominance of the ecosystems of our body and the earth like has a paper trail. Oh, I guess, you know what, we didn't even go into like the economics of reproductive like persecution, and that's like
Mm,
a whole other blind site.
mm,
Like most people are functioning under the illusion that the persecution of fertility management, be it contraception or abortion, is like a religious thing when it's economic.
oh, interesting.
The religious thing is like a distraction from the reality that, the fucking like draft for Roe being overturned, like uses the term domestic supply of infants is in the document. And we have like the bubonic plague, the Industrial Revolution, and now the COVID pandemic are a few examples of others where the persecution of fertility management
Mm,
coincides with labor shortage.
interesting.
And so, like, looking at the political and economic factors here and checking out, Sylvia Federici, Caliban and the Witch, or I really just recommend everybody listen to Book on Fire podcast, which breaks down that book chapter by chapter.
Mm,
Um, it's really beautiful. The book is pretty dense and hard to read, but developing that political and economic lens for why fertility management is being persecuted and what it has to do with labor shortages and the care economy in general,
yeah.
um, I think is really important to be aware of
Mm,
what is
mm,
happening right now, is that it's
hmm.
not just religious.
Totally. Yeah.
And the thing I wanted to restate was like really that the medicalization of fertility management and pregnancy does coincide very deeply with the Industrial Revolution and the industrial ag movement, but even more so, it's just like a huge hangover from the witch hunts
Yeah.
also, and just like expanding our
Hmm.
perspective. Like this was not a credentialed, institutionalized, external authority thing. This is absolutely something that is within our range of motion, our intellectual and sensual, visceral ability. We can avoid and end pregnancies without asking anybody for permission and without consuming from the medical industrial complex. It is absolutely possible. I hope that folks learn how,
Mm,
whether or not
awesome.
they learn from me or they
Yeah.
do their own research in other places. Just understanding that that is our ancestral right. It is not something we need to ask permission for, fill out paperwork, or beg from external
Awesome.
authorities for permission. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Peter.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
This was great. Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and support my work by becoming a patron of the Rewilding Podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And as always, You can help by writing a review on Apple Podcasts and make sure to share on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time.